Chapter 1. Soup Kettle. Things had not been going well. When he threatened to throw himself into a crevasse on Mount Rainier, I canceled the climbing trip. I waited until he felt better before I left him. I moved into a studio apartment but came back to hold a garage sale, where not much sold. In the house, he raised his voice and came toward me, carrying an empty soup kettle. In a flash, he tipped it over and put it on my head. It was dark in the soup pot, and I blinked, stunned at how our love melted down into this moment. He banged on the sides of the kettle with a spoon, and metal reverberated, ringing in my ears. I admit I kept the jointly owned luggage too long, and I should have returned it before his business trip. He had a right to be angry, because I'd busted up our relationship. I wanted him to get a job and stick with it. I didn't want a threesome when he suggested it. But the soup kettle and banging spoon was over the top. I took the pot off my head and laughed, and he joined in, and now we're friends. Chapter 2. Food on my head. Mashed avocado with lemon juice, cool and green, sits on top of my head. Last Monday night, olive oil and fresh rosemary oozed from my scalp into my eyes, and I massaged a mixture of oatmeal, yogurt, and salt in circles on my face. As my 40th birthday approaches, I'm assessing my outlook on life and my appearance. Recently, I decided to nurture myself on Monday nights by soaking in a candlelit bath or trying facial scrubs and hair conditioning ideas in magazines. For 3 years, I watched my young twins apply lumpy oatmeal, applesauce, and spaghetti on their tresses. I've marveled at their soft, shiny hair. To clap this goop on my head is on my wild side. It's almost a dinner, a friend joked, but wild beauty has its drawbacks. Leave on for 5 minutes, the beauty article said, but didn't mention the mini oatmeal mountains would slide off my face onto a red oriental rug as I stepped to the bed to await a 5-minute miracle. Despite the mess, my face did look clear and rosy. One evening, I simmered olive oil and fresh sprigs of rosemary in a saucepan, and the smell permeated the house, whetting my appetite for a feast. I poured warm oil on my hair and wrapped my head in a shower cap, with a towel over that. Oil slid down into my right eye. I washed my hair 3 times to remove the oil, but it did make my hair shiny. Tonight, I'm applying mashed avocado and lemon juice on my hair, making me look like a green-headed sea monster. A babysitter from Chile recommended the recipe when my kids were babies, but I lacked time then to mash avocado on my head. A hairdresser looked down at my head and said, "Looks like you have dandruff. Do you have any stress in your life?" "Yes," I whispered. "Will it end soon?" "I don't think so." Tears streamed down my cheeks and I closed my eyes, fearing I'd bust apart as she scissored my hair. This goop and glop affirms the healing taking place in my soul. A symbolic way of saying yes to renewal and letting go of the past, although avocado's muted green isn't my best color. A friend of mine recently died, and in grieving his death, I embrace what I take to be his message for us all. Be wholly yourself, no matter how strange that may be. My friend was like no other. He was not afraid to be completely himself. He made no attempt to mask his oddities. He ate salad with his fingers to better feel the texture and taste it. His mango eating was full of gusto. He crafted sculptures of sticks from clay. He had protruding ears but didn't care. He was himself. I hope to be more of who I am with fewer apologies. Perhaps putting food on my head is a first step. My friend lived as he liked and followed his heart. With mundane acts of food on my head, I connect with joy, nurture myself, even at home on a Monday night. Written years ago. Chapter 3. Blood dripped down. My maternal grandmother paid for my short stories when I was in 4th grade to encourage me to write. She might have paid a quarter, but the amount doesn't matter. One afternoon, we sat on her floral upholstered sofa in her living room. Light streamed in and birds chirped outside. I smiled as she read my story, because I liked the plot and thought my writing was improving. She set down the handwritten story and wrinkled her nose. Pushing the pages aside, she said, "I don't want to read your writing ever again." My throat tightened with tears. I didn't understand. She had been encouraging me to write. What had changed? She tapped a finger on the lined paper. "Blood, I don't want to read about that." In the story, blood dripped down from the attic into the dining room. The main character, Caroline, hung from a rope in the attic. She crumpled up my story. She said, "I don't want to read anything you write again." Chapter 4. Mistakes were made. Prepare for emergency procedures. Those words uttered by my obstetrician burst my hopes of having an easy birth for my twins. At the center of the emergency was my daughter, who was experiencing difficulty during her birth and needed help fast. In just 2 minutes, my doctor performed a C-section. But my daughter wasn't breathing and had an APGAR score of 0. To save her life, she was placed on a ventilator to pump oxygen into her body. "Please, be a fighter," I prayed. "Live." A doctor and nurse came into my room, saying mistakes were made during the birth. Another doctor pleaded with me not to sue group health because their malpractice insurance would go up. After 3 days at Children's Hospital in Seattle, she was still in danger of dying or having brain damage. That night, I had a dream that she would live. She stomped her foot in my dream, wearing a striped blue dress, and said, "I'm strong, I'm healthy, and I'm going to live." 2 weeks after her birth, our daughter finally breathed on her own, and I held her for the first time. A week later, she was released to another hospital, where her twin brother was in a neonatal unit. My daughter refused to drink from a bottle or breastfeed until a nurse broke the rules and took my son out of the NICU, placing him in her bassinet. Their little prematurely born bodies relaxed, with hints of smiles on their faces. We returned home and weathered 2 years of quarantine, because the machine that saved her life had forced pure oxygen into her lungs and damaged the remaining lung cells. Doctors told us not to allow visitors in our home from October to June, to avoid colds and respiratory viruses that would threaten her life. 3 years of being in quarantine, living with chronic illness, were a long endurance race. We didn't sue the hospital for malpractice, but there was an investigation. And a physician later told me it was declared the worst birth they'd had at the facility. There aren't do-overs for a bad birth, but I wish there were. Fortunately, my twins lived and are flourishing as adults, despite health challenges. If I could go back and do it again differently, I'd ask my 2 weeks overdue pregnant OBGYN not to oversee the birth directly. And I'd pipe up early in the 34-hour labor after my water broke and say, "Do a C-section now, get the babies out, and don't take chances." But hindsight doesn't help now. The words of the anesthesiologist still ring in my ears. He came into the hospital room and said, "Mistakes were made during the birth." Years later, I took my kids to a movie in the University District in Seattle. We waited in line to buy popcorn, and I noticed a woman about my age watching us. She came closer, and I recognized my former OBGYN who had delivered my children. She stared at my red-headed daughter and said in a soft voice, "That's her, isn't it? She lived." "Yes, they call her the miracle baby at Children's Hospital, because she lived." "I gave birth in the room next to yours. I could hear you crying." I nodded. "It was strange to hear you calling out in childbirth, right next door, when I was grieving for my daughter. Doctors said she was going to die." She sighed, still watching my daughter. "I'm sorry." We parted ways and I never saw her again. What if she'd made a different choice in the operating room, and not waited 10 minutes before making an incision and pulling out my daughter? What if the 2 pediatricians on duty, standard operating practice for twins at that time, hadn't both failed to insert a breathing tube down my baby's throat? What if the nurse on duty spoke up when she thought they waited too long to extract the second twin? I learned that one person can make a difference, good or bad, even if we have the best intentions. Every action we take, however small, or if we decide not to speak up and not act, can result in long-ranging consequences, rippling down the line for a lifetime and generations to come. And I learned to be grateful for the good in our lives. We're alive. Previously published and edited for this publication. Chapter 5. Dancing in a Psych Ward. When I was 19, I landed a job as an occupational therapy activity aide in a secure psychiatric unit in an upscale nursing home. It was the summer after my freshman year of college, and I rented a room in a house in Orrington Avenue in Evanston, Illinois. Most days, I went to work with a bandana tied over my brown hair and wearing an embroidered peasant blouse, a knee-length skirt, and sandals. Weekday mornings, I led reality orientation therapy sessions with our 4 most alert residents. They sat in plastic chairs facing a chalkboard in the linoleum-tiled day room while others dozed in armchairs. Lawrence was thin and frail. John had broad shoulders, strong hands, and a shy smile. In a flowered housecoat, Rose clutched a handbag under her arm. Elizabeth had curly white hair and piercing blue eyes. Standing before them the first time, my hands trembled. Who was I to lead this class? I'd volunteered in nursing homes during high school, but this was different. I was in a psych ward. My job was to ask each person for their name and to write it on a chalkboard. Lawrence, John, and Rose quickly replied, but when I asked Elizabeth for her name, she pressed her lips together and shook her head. She stared, holding eye contact for a beat too long, as if pleading with me for something. Her mouth was caved in. Her dentures had been stolen 3 times, and her family refused to replace them again. Charging ahead with youth's purpose, I said, "Your name is Elizabeth, isn't it?" When she didn't reply, I carried on with class. It was part of my job, and I needed to pay the rent. Rose stood and tucked her purse under her arm. "I need to go shopping." She marched away. I race-walked after her and gently took her arm, guiding her back to the group. The job was a bigger challenge than I'd expected. Next, I asked my small group to name the president. They sat in silence for a moment. Lawrence said in a wavering voice, "Ford." "That's right," I said, writing the name on the chalkboard. The year was the most difficult question. Time sifted like sand between our fingers in the secure ward. Each second was like the last. "It's 1975, I said, writing it on the board. "That's all for today. Thanks for coming." After each class, Rose hurried away with her handbag, while John shuffled off with a slight smile on his lips. Lawrence said, "Thank you." "I'm glad to know you," I said, looking into his watery gray-blue eyes and meaning every word of it. How had he ended up in this locked ward? I wondered what it was like for him to live here. Elizabeth held my gaze and nodded before going to sit in a chair by the window. The urge to flee is contagious in a closed environment. For my part, I was glad to leave when my shift ended and go out for a beer with friends. The thin-walled room I rented from a squabbling family wasn't an inviting place to relax after work. Most afternoons, Rose stood by the sliding glass doors ready to run to the elevator and go shopping. "I have to make dinner," she said. When I stepped into the elevator at the end of the day, Rose waved from the other side of the glass, as if I was going off on an adventure. I'd wave back and swallow hard. She was stuck inside, but I was heading out for a fun evening. We were bookends in the aging process, and it didn't seem fair. In contrast to Rose, John managed to slip out and ride the elevator every few weeks. He ambled to a bar a block away for a beer. When the police brought him back, a nurse or aide would throw up their hands and say, "He got away again?" He'd just smile and shrug. One afternoon, my boss, another aide, and I took residents from the independent living first-floor units and 3 residents from my floor to a classical music concert in a nearby park. My small pod's pace was slow. Every bird and car passing by was a marvel after being indoors. Lawrence eyed each crack in the sidewalk as if it was ready to take him down, but he motored ahead with a steady pace. Elizabeth squeezed my hand and was silent as we went down tree-lined streets. During the concert, Rose hurried off. I ran after her, and she came back with me, humming a happy tune. Some residents belonged in a secure ward. Frances was restrained to an armchair in the day room. When I breezed by, she pointed to a bandana on my head. "Babushka! My name is Frances. I'm from Czechoslovakia." I patted my head and smiled at her in a kindred spirit kind of moment. But because I'd seen her lash out with hands like claws, stopped only by cloth restraints, I stood 2 feet back. At lunch one day, I sat with my boss by a window in the dining room. The table was covered with a white linen tablecloth. A pewter bud vase held a single red rose. I took a bite of beef stroganoff, and something hurled past the window, looking like a human body. It hit the pavement with a thud. My boss and I ran out an emergency exit, along with the chef wearing a white hat. We were first on the scene. A crumpled human form was splayed on the pavement. Blood oozed out of the man's skull, forming a growing puddle. A nurse in a white dress ran out and knelt to take his pulse. He's dead. I blinked back tears and looked up. On the 4th floor, a window in a residence room was open. A nurse in white looked down. The man on the pavement was Frank, a retired professional basketball player. He wasn't on my floor, but I'd heard him yelling at his son when he was wheeled into the nursing home. "I want to stay home," Frank said. He gripped the wheelchair with veined hands. His son pushed the wheelchair. "Dad, you can't live at home. You can't make me live here." But his son did. For the short time Frank was a resident, he lived on a floor in the nursing home where residents could come and go. But it wasn't enough for him. He wanted to be home. Although the window in Frank's room was double-locked, he had managed to pull himself out of the wheelchair, open the window, and throw himself out in a desperate final act. I never learned how he managed to open the secure window, but I imagine his determination was fueled by rage at his son's betrayal. I hadn't known Frank well, but I still felt sick. We needed more joy in this place. I asked if I could play music in the psychiatric unit and dance with residents, and my boss and the charge nurse gave me permission. Rummaging in a wooden storage unit in the 1st floor activity room, I pulled out a portable turntable and hauled it up to the psych ward. I cleared an oval dance floor by moving plastic chairs aside and put on a Hank Williams album. It was either Hank or Burl Ives, because we only had 2 albums. I clapped my hands in the day room and defied the stark white walls. On this day, on this afternoon, for just an hour, I was determined for us to experience joy, even if it was from a vinyl easy chair. "Come dance with me," I called to white-haired, gray-haired, and balding residents who dozed in recliners. A few opened their eyes and looked my way. The television droned. I marched over to the TV and turned it off. "We're going to try something different. Let's dance." Florence and Marvin sashayed onto the dance floor and moved like practiced ballroom dancers. Elizabeth stood watching at the edge of the dance floor. Rose shuffled over to me with open arms, and we swayed to the music. At the end of the song, I thanked Rose for the dance and went to find another partner. Extending a hand to Elizabeth, I said, "May I have this dance?" Her chin trembled, and she nodded as she stepped into my arms. Elizabeth was light on her feet, and she clasped my shoulders like I was a life raft. While we danced, she rasped in my ear, "My name is Elsie." Goosebumps pricked my flesh, and a chill ran up my spine. That's why she wouldn't speak. I had the wrong name. It wasn't dentures she wanted, but to feel loved. Looking into her sparkling blue eyes, I said, "I'm glad to know your name." From that moment on, we spoke as if we were old friends. When Lawrence passed away, his family didn't come to claim his things. Staff members were allowed to select items from his belongings. I took Lawrence's soft blue and white checked shirt as a way to remember him and his valiant courage. Until the end, he was a gentleman of grace in the midst of occasional chaos in the psych ward. September came, bringing the smell of fall. Oak leaves rustled, awakening in me an urgent need to go to college. On a whim, I picked up the phone and placed calls. Wayne State and Detroit said they'd take me and classes started soon. University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill and University of Colorado in Boulder told me it was possible to get in at the last moment. When I spoke with the registrar at University of Oregon, a friendly woman said, "If your grades are as good as you say they are, we'll accept you. Have your previous college send the transcript right away. Classes start in a week." When I told Elsie, John, and Rose about my decision to move to the West Coast, they nodded and looked understanding. But their eyes conveyed a sense of longing, as if they'd like to go with me and have an adventure. And I wish I could have taken them. The afternoon before I left, I stopped in to see Elsie, who had fallen ill. She was in bed with the sheets pulled up to her chin and her eyes were closed. Taking her hand, I said, "I'll always love you. Goodbye." Her eyelids fluttered and she squeezed my hand. I left her room with a lump in my throat. It wasn't fair that I was able to explore the world while she was locked in a secure ward. I flew away for the both of us and sent her imaginary fragments of the freedom she missed. I later learned she passed away in her sleep several days after I last saw her. I still get teary thinking about her. Off I went, flying across the country and starting a new life. But those residents in the psych ward are still with me, dancing in my mind. I wore Lawrence's soft blue and white check shirt for years before finally letting it go, frayed cuffs and all, into the trash. But in a way, I still wear Lawrence's shirt on my back because knowing him and the other residents changed my life. And I hope I made a difference in their lives too. My experiences working in a psychiatric ward influenced my psychological thrillers, Shore Lodge and The Winter Storm, and you can read more about those brave souls in my books. Chapter 6. Married to the Same Man. A friend told me her cousin had been married to my ex-husband and showed me a photo of her. At my friend's party, I noticed a woman who might be the cousin, and I took a risk, sidling up to her when she was alone. I said, "I think we were married to the same man." Her face went pale, her hands trembled, and she walked toward a table holding bottles of wine. She filled a tall tumbler with red wine and came back to me. "Did he do that thing to you too?" The room went quiet. No one spoke and people stared at us, watching and waiting for what we'd say next. A CD of Robert Cray singing crooned in the background, but we'd become the entertainment. I said in a low voice, "What do you mean?" She whispered, "You know, that thing." I swallowed, feeling out of my depth, with my imagination running wild. She sipped red wine and leaned in. "Where he didn't talk to you for days?" I let out a breath and nodded. "Yeah, he did. It was really strange." Conversations resumed, swirling around us, and we stepped into a shared weird world, talking for 20 minutes. Later that night, I drove home, smiling and feeling oddly satisfied to have met the owner of the broken leather purse I'd found in his basement, left behind as if she'd fled the premises in a hurry many years ago. Chapter 7. Cracked Glaze. A potter I knew in a group studio had smashing success making dinner place settings for couples about to be married. But one day, a couple marched into the studio carrying a plate with cracked glaze. They were unhappy, from what I overheard, and wanted their money back. Most potters were paupers, so that wasn't an easy ask. A second couple darkened the door of the pottery studio, showing a problematic plate and making the same request, and a ripple of concern ran around the room. Eventually, the potter left the city and moved to Mexico, never to be found. I was startled by her starting over story and thought it took courage, but it also smelled of running away from problems and leaving others holding pottery with cracked glaze. Little did I know the same problem loomed ahead in my future. I opened my own studio and small gallery in the Ballard neighborhood of Seattle, and to my surprise and delight, customers lined up to buy pots when I'd open a kiln and unload a glazing firing on Saturdays. It was a potter's dream to sell right out of a kiln. One day, I opened a kiln and stared at clay pots that had cracked during a bisque firing. Platters pulled apart. Bowls looked like they were ripped on the rims. I had to throw them out. The next batch had the same issue. After some research, I determined that the batch of clay I'd bought must be defective, and it took months for me to convince the vendor that it wasn't my fault. I was sure they left out part of an ingredient when mixing my clay. When the bad batch of clay was replaced by the company in South Seattle, I thought I'd left my business problems behind. I had attracted a wholesale customer with a friend's help and sold platters shaped like salmon and fish-shaped clocks to a store with many locations. But the store brought them back. My friend who had recommended me frowned and said, "They're blaming me for the problem. Customers are bringing them back in droves. The clocks aren't keeping time." She walked out and I never saw her again. I called the clock mechanism company, and after 3 phone calls, they admitted they had substituted a new part in the batch of clocks I bought. They sent a new shipment out, but it was too late. The company selling my fish clocks and platters never wanted to do business with me again. They didn't trust me. Next, a clear glaze I applied on my pottery started to crack. The supplier blamed me and how I fired the pots, but it had never happened before. Finally, I threw out the jugs of glaze and bought new ones from a different batch. That was the end of my problems as a potter, I thought, until a man in a blue shirt and khaki pants came into my studio. I smiled and we chatted about the pottery. He glanced at a bowl, said he liked it, and I said, "Would you like to buy it?" He shook his head. "No, I'm here on business, and I'm from the city. I don't know if you heard this, but we're closing the street for sewer repairs, and it'll take a few months." My throat tightened with tears. I didn't need this. "A few months?" He nodded. "Maybe more like 3 or 4. We'll see how the project goes." I swallowed hard, not knowing if my shop could survive a road closure, especially one that long. The construction project took more than 4 months. When the street reopened, very few customers came in. Looking at my bank balance and around the empty store, I realized my dream of running a pottery studio and gift shop had run its course. I locked the door and sobbed all the way home. Chapter 8. Shopping Cart. I set up my fair booth at an art show in Gig Harbor, Washington, and a soft breeze blew off the water, pulling tendrils of hair from my ponytail. I placed porcelain pottery bowls on black wire shelves and shoved my hands in the pockets of my green overalls. Glancing at other artists, I smiled. This was going to be a good day for sales. I could feel it in my bones, smell it in the briny sea air wafting past, and sense it in the crackling energy around me as people buzzed about setting up booths. A storm had blown through the night before, and wet, cold pavement radiated a chill through my feet. I glanced at a box beneath my table, where foul-weather gear was stowed. If needed, I could pull on a rain hat, jacket, and pants that I bought from a retired fisherman at a garage sale. I had matching green rain boots at the ready, too. In the first hour or so of the show, I sold a few bowls to middle-aged women with shoulder-length hair. I was sipping water from a plastic bottle and alone in the booth when something caught my attention out of the corner of my eye. On the other side of my booth, a metal shopping cart with a young child in the seat was rolling down a slight incline and aiming right for my pottery displayed on wire shelves. The girl, who might have been 3 or 4, watched as she traveled toward my wares. Images of her falling, breaking bones and pottery flashed through my mind. I dropped the water bottle and ran around the booth. I lunged forward, reached out my hand and grabbed the back of the shopping cart. It suddenly stopped, just before smacking into my booth. The little girl sobbed from the jolt. I cooed to her and said it was going to be fine and where was her mother. I craned my neck, searching for a family member. Seconds later, a worried woman in her early 30s trotted over, apologizing profusely and asking her daughter if she was okay. "Thank you so much," she said. Her eyes fell on my display, and she pointed to a shelf of my work. "I'll buy those." She nodded to another shelf. "And I'll buy those too. I can never repay you enough for saving her." And that's how she became one of my best customers. Chapter 9. Water Everywhere. My 4-year-old twins were quietly reading picture books, and I slipped into the bathroom to take a quick shower. But as I scrubbed, the water pressure dropped. I heard squeals of delight coming from the kitchen. I turned off the water, wrapped myself in a towel, and strode into the kitchen. My mouth fell open. In the matter of minutes, using the sprayer on the kitchen faucet, they had covered the floor, cabinets, and windows with water. "Don't do this again," I said, grabbing a sponge mop and wiping the wet floor. Later, I read in a research study that if you say, "Don't run," some children hear, "Run." Perhaps my mistake was telling them what not to do, instead of making positive statements. When I mentioned the water incident to a woman, she shook her head. "That's nothing compared to what happened to us. Our twin grandchildren, a girl and a boy, were visiting and playing in the basement. They loaded an entire box of detergent in the washer and turned the machine on. Soap suds filled the basement, and the water was a few feet deep before we noticed. We had to get rid of the washer, which wouldn't work after that. It was a mess to clean up, and it cost a lot." She wiped her brow, and we agreed that a special blend of mischief can run in fraternal twins, who often care more about what their twin thinks than adult approval. I knew I needed help to become a better parent, so I signed up for a University of Washington School of Nursing study. They observed us in our home environment and suggested I give fewer commands and focus on 2 or 3 behaviors I wanted to change, using positive statements and rewards. I had a binder listing positive behaviors and associated reward points that could be redeemed for TV time, a fast food meal, or cash. Within 6 months, my kids were on time for the school bus, and they turned in their homework. I just needed a little help to turn 2 wild hellions into capable future citizens. Chapter 10. Lake City Way. My kids and I left a store on Lake City Way, and my son said, "Watch how fast I can run." Traffic was stopped at a nearby light, and although he was about 4 years old, he was fleetingly fast on the temporarily deserted road. I sucked in a breath and took off, calling on all my strength to keep up with him. Pumping my arms, running after him in the road, I tapped my reserves and recalled being on a college track team. I had to grab him before a car hit him. "Come on," I told myself. "Catch him before he's hit." He ran ahead, feet flying, laughing. I worried about my daughter, but she stayed on the sidewalk, following us. Traffic moved, coming toward us, so the light must have changed. The cars could end my son's life if I didn't save him. Giving it all I had, I leaned forward, grabbed my son, and hauled him off the road to the sidewalk, where his sister stood, gaping. Just then, a car chugged by, right where he'd stood moments ago.